67%. That is how much of the continental United States is abnormally dry or in outright drought as you watch this. Roughly 2 out of every 3 parts of the country running low on water at the very same time. And almost nobody is talking about it because a drought is the one disaster that never hands you a single dramatic moment. It just creeps, quietly, day after day, until a spark in a dry corner of Utah becomes 150 square miles of fire that no crew on Earth can contain. That is exactly where we are today, and the dryness is not easing, it is escalating, with the hottest heat of the summer still ahead of us. Before we get into it, do me a favour and tap that like button and subscribe to the Sky Lab, where we break down the forces shaping our skies and the ground beneath our feet, and drop a comment telling me where you are watching from and whether you have felt this drought where you live. Now let's get into it. Part 1. The fire is not the story. Somewhere in the high desert of southern Utah right now, a fire is burning that not a single crew on Earth has managed to slow down. It has a name. They call it the Babylon Fire. It was first spotted on June 26th, a small heat signature in dry country, the kind of thing that starts 100 times a summer and usually dies quietly. This one did not die. By this morning, 11 days later, it had grown to 96,564 acres. That is roughly 151 square miles. It is larger than most American cities. And here is the number that should stop you cold. The containment on that fire, after 11 days, after aircraft and hand crews and bulldozers and everything the most advanced firefighting system in the world can throw at a wildfire, stands at 0%, not 5, not 2, 0. Now, when a fire reaches that size with no line held around any part of it, firefighters will tell you something specific is happening. It is not that they are not trying. It is that the fire is moving faster than anyone can build a barrier in front of it, because the fuel it is eating, the grass and the brush and the timber, is so dry that it ignites the instant an ember touches it. The fire is not outrunning the crews, the fire is outrunning the countryside's ability to resist burning at all. And that is the thing I want you to hold on to, because that fire, the one you can see on the news, the one with the orange glow and the smoke plume you can watch from space, is not actually the story today. The fire is a symptom. The disease is underneath it, and it is spreading across the entire country, and almost no one is talking about it. As of this week, according to the United States Drought Monitor, roughly 2/3 of the continental United States is either abnormally dry or in outright drought. Let me give you the exact figure, because the exactness matters here. 67% of the lower 48 states is currently classified as abnormally dry or worse. Think about that geographically for a second. Draw the map of the country in your head. Now imagine 2 out of every 3 parts of it shaded in some tone of yellow, orange or red. That is not a regional dry spell. That is a continent quietly running low on water, and the fire in Utah is simply the first place where the consequences became impossible to ignore, because they lit up the sky. It helps to picture the country where this fire is burning, because the geography is part of why it caught the way it did. Southern Utah is high desert, a land of red rock and open range, a pinyon pine and juniper and sagebrush, laced through with grasses that cure to gold and then to tinder as the summer wears on. In a wet year, that country carries its dry season with a certain resilience. The deeper-rooted plants hold on, the soil keeps a little moisture in the shade, and a fire that starts has to work to spread. But this has not been a wet year. This has been the driest stretch that ground has seen in a long time, and the vegetation that would normally resist has instead been converted into a continuous bed of fuel, ready to carry flame from one patch to the next without a break. When the Babylon Fire was first reported on June 26th, it was a manageable thing. Within days it was not, because every direction it reached held more fuel just as dry as the last. That is not a story about a single spark. It is a story about a countryside that had been prepared, over months of drought, to burn all at once. And it is not happening in isolation, which is the part that should really land. If the Babylon Fire were the only large fire in the West, you could tell yourself it was a fluke, a bad break, a single unlucky ignition in a single dry spot. But it is one of many. Across Utah and Colorado and Arizona, a whole cluster of large fires is burning at the same time, on the same drought-cured fuel, under the same hot and windy skies. When many large fires ignite across a wide region in the same short window, That is not a coincidence of many separate sparks. That is a signal about the condition of the entire region. The sparks are always there. Lightning, equipment, roadsides, the ordinary sources never stop. What changes from a quiet year to a catastrophic one is the state of the fuel, and right now the fuel across the interior west is in a state that turns ordinary sparks into 100-square-mile fires. The map of these fires is really a map of the drought, drawn in flame. This is what makes drought such a strange and dangerous kind of disaster. Almost every other catastrophe this channel covers announces itself. A hurricane has a name and a landfall and a moment. An earthquake has a timestamp measured to the second. A solar storm arrives on a schedule we can forecast days in advance. They are events. They have a before and an after. Drought has neither. Drought is the slow disaster. It creeps. It arrives so gradually that on any given day nothing looks different from the day before, and by the time it is undeniable, it is already enormous, already continental, already producing fires that no one can stop. There is no single morning where a drought makes the front page, because there is no single morning where a drought does anything dramatic. It just keeps not raining, and the ground keeps getting thirstier, and the reservoirs keep dropping an inch at a time, and one day a spark in Utah becomes 150 square miles of fire that will not go out. And I want to be honest with you right from the start, because this channel does not do fear without facts. If you looked only at one number this week, you might actually think the drought is getting better. The nationwide figure for severe drought, the second worst category, ticked down slightly over the past 7 days by a little under 3 percentage points. That improvement is real. It happened because some rain fell in the eastern half of the country. But that single number hides something, and understanding what it hides is the whole reason this video exists. Because at the exact same time that a national average was inching in the right direction, the western half of the country, the half that was already the driest, kept getting drier. The half where the fires are. One number went down, the place that matters went up, and if you only watched the headline number, you would have no idea that a fire was about to outrun every crew in the state of Utah. So here is the thread I am going to pull on for the rest of this. The drought is the real story. It is escalating in the places that produce disasters, even when the national scoreboard says otherwise. It is being driven by something most people do not associate with drought at all, and I will show you exactly what that is. It is feeding on itself in a way that makes it accelerate rather than fade. And it is about to collide this very weekend with the hottest stretch of the summer so far, in a way that is going to pour fuel on everything I'm about to describe. The fire in Utah is not the emergency. The fire in Utah is the warning light on the dashboard. And the question I want you to be asking by the end is not why is Utah burning? The question is what happens to 2/3 of a country when the ground is this dry and the worst heat has not even arrived yet. Before we go there, I want to sit with that 0% for one more moment, because I do not think most people understand what it actually means, and the misunderstanding matters. When a fire agency reports a containment percentage, they are not telling you how much of the fire has been put out. They are telling you what fraction of the perimeter, the outer edge of the fire, has a completed control line around it, a barrier of cleared earth or a natural feature that the fire is not expected to cross. So 0% containment does not mean the crews have made no effort. It means that after 11 days of effort, there is not a single stretch of the fire's edge that firefighters are confident will hold. The entire perimeter is still live. The entire perimeter can still move. On a fire that has already reached 150 square miles, that is an extraordinary statement about how the fire is behaving and about the country it is burning through. Think about what it takes to hold even a small piece of a fire's edge. Crews cut a line down to bare mineral soil, wide enough that the flames have nothing to cross on, or they use a road or a river or a ridge as a natural barrier and burn out the fuel between it and the fire. When that line holds, that stretch of the perimeter gets counted as contained. For a fire the size of Babylon, the perimeter runs for many, many miles, and to report 0% means that not one of those miles is holding. Every attempt to draw a line has been overrun, or the fire has jumped it, or conditions have been too dangerous to put crews there in the first place. That is a remarkable thing for the most well-resourced firefighting system on the planet to be unable to do, and it does not happen because of a lack of effort or skill. It happens because the fire keeps doing the one thing that defeats a control line, throwing itself across every barrier faster than a barrier can be built. To reach that size in 11 days, a fire has to average roughly 9,000 acres of growth every single day, and it has to do that while aircraft are dropping retardant and crews are cutting line, and every tool in the arsenal is being deployed against it. That only happens when the fire is doing things that make direct attack impossible. It happens when a fire is throwing embers a mile or more ahead of itself and starting new fires that merge back into the main one. It happens when a fire builds its own weather, a towering column of superheated air that collapses and sends winds racing outward in unpredictable directions. Firefighters call the most extreme version of this a plume-dominated fire, and when a fire enters that state, the safest and often the only option is to pull crews back, protect what structures can be protected, and wait for the weather or the fuel to change. You do not put a hand crew in front of a fire that is generating its own wind, and the reason a fire reaches that state, again and again, comes back to one thing. The fuel is dry enough to release its energy all at once. Now hold that image against the way we normally think about disasters, because the contrast is the whole point. When a hurricane is coming, there is a cone on a map, a countdown, a landfall, a moment everyone braces for. When an earthquake strikes, there is a precise second, a magnitude, a before and an after you can point to. Even a wildfire, for all its horror, gives you a plume of smoke and a flame front you can photograph. Drought gives you none of that. Drought is the disaster with no moment. It has no landfall, no epicenter, no single second where it arrives. It is made entirely of absence, the absence of rain, the absence of soil moisture, the absence of runoff into the reservoirs, and absence is nearly impossible to photograph or to fear in real time. You cannot put a countdown on a thing that is defined by what is not happening. That is precisely what makes it so dangerous. Human beings are wired to respond to sudden threats and to tune out gradual ones. We will evacuate a coastline in front of a storm, but we will watch a drought deepen for months and never quite register it as an emergency, because on no single day did it look meaningfully worse than the day before. The federal government's own disaster accounting has repeatedly shown that drought and the heat that travels with it rank among the most costly and most deadly of all weather-related hazards over time, and yet they command a small fraction of the public attention that a single hurricane pulls in for a single week. The slow disaster hides inside its own slowness, and the fire in Utah is what it looks like on the rare occasion when the slow disaster finally does something fast enough and bright enough to force its way onto a screen. We look at the flames, and we call it a fire problem, and we miss that the flames are only the drought becoming briefly visible. So the fire is not the story. The fire is the alarm. And the thread I'm going to hold from here to the end is this. The drought underneath that fire is spreading across most of the country. It is escalating in the places that matter. Even when the national numbers say otherwise, it is being driven by a force most people never connect to drought at all. It is feeding on itself, and it is about to collide with the hottest air of the summer. Every part of this comes back to that single trunk. Let me show you what that dryness actually looks like, because the scale of it is genuinely hard to believe until you see the numbers laid out. Part 2. 2/3 of a country. To understand how bad this is, you first have to understand how scientists actually measure a drought, because it is not as simple as counting the days since it last rained. In the United States, drought is tracked by something called the Drought Monitor, and it sorts the severity of dryness into 5 steps. The mildest is called D0, or abnormally dry. That is the warning stage, the land where the grass is browning early and the topsoil is short on moisture, but nothing has broken yet. Above that is D1, moderate drought, then D2, severe drought, then D3, extreme drought, and at the very top of the scale sits D4, exceptional drought, the worst category that exists, reserved for places where crops and pasture are failing on a wide scale, and where water shortages in reservoirs, streams and wells are creating outright emergencies. 5 steps, from a land that is merely thirsty to a land that is running out of water entirely. Now let me walk you up that ladder using this week's real numbers, because each rung tells a piece of the story. At the bottom, 67% of the continental United States is in that abnormally dry category or worse. 2 out of 3, but abnormally dry is the gentle end, so let us keep climbing. When you count only the land in actual drought, D1 and above, you are still looking at nearly 48% of the country. Almost half of the lower 48 states is in genuine drought right now. Climb one more rung to severe drought. D2 and worse, and you're at roughly 31%. Nearly a third of the entire country is in severe drought or worse. Keep going. Extreme drought, D3 and above, covers just under 11% of the country. Better than 1 acre in 10 across the whole continental United States sits in the top 2 categories of dryness that exist. And at the very summit in that exceptional category, D4, the water emergency category, sits 1% of the country. 1% might sound small until you remember what it means. It means that somewhere in America, a piece of land the size of a small state is in the single most severe drought classification the system is capable of assigning. Exceptional drought is not a forecast or a worry. It is a designation that gets applied only when the wells and the reservoirs and the streams are already in crisis. And it is not an isolated dot. It sits at the peak of a pyramid, and underneath it are those widening layers. 31% in severe, 48% in drought, 67% abnormally dry. All of it stacked up beneath that 1% summit of true emergency. Here is a way to feel the shape of it. Picture the country as 100 people standing in a field. 67 of them are standing on ground that is at least abnormally dry. 48 are standing in real drought. 31 are in severe drought. 11 are in extreme drought, the second worst category we have, and one of them is standing on ground where the water has effectively run out. That is not a drought in one corner of the map. That is a condition that has spread underneath the majority of the nation, and most of the people living on that ground have no idea they are standing on it, because the day looks like any other day. And this is where I have to return to that honesty point from a moment ago, because it is genuinely important and most coverage gets it wrong in both directions. Over the past week, the amount of the country in severe drought or worse actually shrank by a little under 3 percentage points. If you are the kind of person who likes good news, that is good news, and I am not going to pretend it away. Rain fell across parts of the eastern United States. Some rivers came up. Some soil got a drink. On the national scoreboard, the drought took one small step backward, but averages lie, and they lie in a very particular way. A national average blends the entire country into a single number, which means a wet week in the east can mathematically cancel out a worsening week in the west, and the scoreboard will read improvement even as the most dangerous region on the map gets worse. That is exactly what happened this week. The rain that improved the number fell mostly in the east. It did not fall on the fuel around the Babylon fire. It did not fall on the reservoirs of the interior west. The places driving toward catastrophe kept drying, while the average told a soothing story about the whole. And so you get this genuinely surreal situation where a person reading a one-line drought summary could reasonably conclude things are getting better on the same day that a fire in Utah is proving in real time that things in the west are getting worse. Both statements are true. Only one of them is about the place where people are being evacuated. This is the trap of the slow disaster. It hides inside aggregate numbers. It hides inside the fact that the worst hit land is often the emptiest land, the high desert and the rangeland and the backcountry, where there are fewer cameras and fewer voices to say this is an emergency. And it hides inside our own attention spans, because a drought never gives you the single shocking image that a flood or a tornado hands you for free. It gives you a slightly too brown lawn, and a slightly lower lake, and a slightly earlier fire season, over and over, until the slightlies add up to 2/3 of a country, and a fire no one can contain. Put this footprint in perspective, because 67% is not a number the country hits casually. In a typical year, the amount of the lower 48 in drought fluctuates. Sometimes it is low, 1/5 of the country or less. Sometimes in a bad year it climbs toward half. To have 2/3 of the nation abnormally dry or worse, with nearly 1/3 in severe drought and a piece of it in the exceptional category all at the same time, is a large footprint event by any measure. It is the kind of coverage that puts a summer in the record books, not for a single dramatic day, but for the sheer breadth of the dryness. And breadth is its own kind of danger, separate from depth, because a drought spread across 2/3 of a continent stresses the whole system at once. It means the fires and the water shortages and the crop losses are not competing for sympathy in one corner of the map. They are unfolding everywhere the dryness reaches, which is nearly everywhere. It also helps to translate the middle of the ladder into something you can feel, because the extremes get all the attention, but the broad categories are where most of the country actually sits. Abnormally dry, the bottom rung, is the stage where lawns brown early, where the fire season starts sooner than it should, where the first water use reminders go out. Moderate drought is where the streams run low and the dryland crops start to suffer and voluntary conservation begins. Severe drought, the category that covers nearly a third of the country right now, is where crop and pasture losses become likely, where water restrictions become common, and where the fire danger climbs toward the top of the scale. So even setting aside the extreme and exceptional zones, the simple fact that 31% of the nation sits in severe drought means that across a third of the country, the conditions that produce real agricultural loss and real water restriction are already present. That is not a warning about the future. That is the current state of a third of the land. There is a reason the West in particular is so exposed to all of this, and it comes down to how the region stores its water. Much of the interior West does not rely on rain falling steadily through the summer. It relies on the mountain snowpack that builds up through the winter and then melts slowly through the spring and early summer, feeding the rivers and filling the reservoirs that carry the region through the dry months. The snowpack is the West's water tower, and in a warm, dry year, that tower fails in two ways at once. Less snow accumulates in the first place, and what does accumulate melts earlier and faster, running off before the hot, dry peak of summer when it is needed most. So by the time July arrives, a bad snow year has already left the reservoirs lower than they should be, and the soil's primed to dry out, and then the summer heat goes to work on what little remains. The drought you see on the surface in July was, in part, written months earlier in a mountain snowpack that came up short. That is why the West can tip so quickly into extreme fire conditions. Its entire water supply is front-loaded into a snowpack, and when that snowpack fails, there is no steady summer rain to fall back on. There is one more feature of these numbers that matters, and it is persistence. A drought is not just how dry it is on 1 week. It is how long the dryness has held, because the effects compound over time. A single dry month is a nuisance. A dry season stacked on top of a dry previous season is a crisis, because the deficits add up. The soil moisture never recovers, the reservoirs never refill, and the deeper groundwater keeps getting drawn down with no chance to recharge. The drought gripping the West right now is not a one-week event that showed up on this particular map. It is the accumulated deficit of a long dry stretch, which is exactly why the fuel is so primed and the fires are so hard to catch. The map shows you a snapshot. The danger comes from the fact that the snapshot has looked like this, or worse, for a long time. It helps to know how that map's actually made, because it is far more rigorous than a single rain gauge, and understanding it tells you why these categories carry real weight. The drought monitor is not the opinion of one person looking at the sky. It is a weekly synthesis, built by rotating teams of climate scientists who combine a whole battery of independent measurements into one picture. They look at how far precipitation has fallen below normal over multiple time windows, from a few weeks to a couple of years. They look at soil moisture, measured and modelled at different depths. They look at stream flow, the level of the rivers, gauged at thousands of points. They look at the mountain snowpack and how fast it melted, because in the West the snow is the water tower for the whole dry season. They look at reservoir storage. They even look at satellite readings of how healthy or stressed the vegetation is, because plants under water stress show up from orbit. All of that gets folded together, cross-checked against reports from people on the ground, and distilled into those 5 categories. So when a region is placed in extreme or exceptional drought, that is not a guess. That is a convergence of many independent lines of evidence all saying the same thing. The water is not there. And each of those top categories has a real, human meaning attached to it, defined by what actually happens to people and land on the ground. Extreme drought, D3, is the category where major crop and pasture losses become widespread, where fire risk becomes extreme, and where water shortages become common enough to trigger restrictions. Exceptional drought, D4, the very top of the scale, is reserved for the conditions that produce genuine emergencies, exceptional and widespread losses of crops and pasture, and shortages of water in reservoirs, streams and wells so severe that they create water emergencies. When you hear that 1% of the country is in exceptional drought, translate it out of the abstract. Somewhere on that map, wells are running dry. Ranchers are hauling water to livestock or selling off herds they can no longer keep watered. Communities are looking at their reservoirs and doing math about how many months of supply they have left. That is what the top of the ladder means. It is not a colour on a chart. It is a water emergency happening to real people in real towns. Geography matters here too, because the drought is not spread evenly, and where it is concentrated is exactly where the danger stacks. The most intense drought is gripping the interior west and the Four Corners region, the high desert and mountain country where Utah, Colorado, Arizona and New Mexico meet, along with stretches of the Great Basin and the Southern Plains. That is not a coincidence, and it is not a random draw. That is precisely the country where the fires are burning right now. The overlap is not an accident. It is the entire mechanism, because the drought is what dried the fuel, and the dry fuel is what feeds the fire. When you lay the fire map over the drought map, they are nearly the same map. The Babylon fire is not burning in a random place. It is burning in the bullseye of the driest, most escalated part of the entire country. And this is why that reassuring national number is so genuinely misleading, and why I keep coming back to it. The improvement last week was real, but it was an eastern improvement, and the east is not where the crisis lives. The crisis lives in the west, and the west got worse. A single national average has no way to tell you that, because averaging is designed to smooth away exactly the kind of regional extremes that matter most. It is the statistical equivalent of standing with 1 foot in a bucket of ice and 1 foot in a fire, and reporting that, on average, you feel fine. The number is true and the number is useless at the same time, and the gap between those two things is where a fire in Utah can grow to 150 square miles, while a person reading a summary concludes the drought is easing. So we have established the scale. 2/3 of the nation is drying out, nearly a third is in severe drought or worse, and the region that is worst is getting worse, even as the national number offers false comfort. But a scale is not a cause. Knowing how much of the country is dry does not tell you why it is drying, or why this particular drought is escalating instead of breaking. And the answer to that question is going to surprise a lot of people, because the single biggest force driving this drought deeper is not the absence of rain at all. It is something else entirely, something that is about to get dramatically worse this weekend, and once you understand it, you will never look at a hot forecast the same way again. Part 3. The thirst of the air. Ask most people what causes a drought, and they will give you the obvious answer. A drought happens when it stops raining. And that is true, as far as it goes. If the rain that normally falls on a region simply does not arrive, the ground dries out. But that answer is only half of the equation, and it is the less important half for understanding why this particular drought is escalating rather than easing. Because a drought is not only about the water that fails to fall from the sky, it is also about the water that gets pulled out of the ground from above, and the force doing that pulling is the atmosphere itself, and specifically, how thirsty the atmosphere is. Scientists have a term for this. They call it evaporative demand, and it is one of the most underappreciated ideas in all of weather and climate. Evaporative demand is a measure of how aggressively the air wants to suck moisture out of everything it touches, out of the soil, out of leaves and grass and pine needles, out of lakes and reservoirs and rivers. The air is always doing this to some degree, but how strongly it does it depends on one thing above all others: temperature. And here is the physics that makes this so important, the single piece of science I most want you to walk away with today. Warm air can hold dramatically more water vapour than cool air. This is not a small effect, and it is not a matter of opinion. It is a fundamental law of physics, and it has a name, the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship. And it says that for every 1 degree Celsius the air warms, its capacity to hold water vapour increases by roughly 7%. 7% per degree does not sound like much until you start stacking degrees. Warm the air by a few degrees above normal, which is exactly what a heatwave does, and you have increased its thirst by 15, 20, 25%. A hotter atmosphere is a hungrier atmosphere. It reaches down into the soil and it pulls the moisture out faster. It reaches into the vegetation and it draws the water out of every living plant. It reaches across the surface of a reservoir and it lifts the water away as vapour at an accelerated rate. So even if the exact same amount of rain falls in a hot year as in a cool year, the hot year will produce a deeper drought because the atmosphere is stealing more of that water back before it can do any good. The rain deficit tells you how much water failed to arrive. The evaporative demand tells you how much water is being taken away. and a drought is the gap between the two. This is why you cannot separate this drought from heat, and it is why the forecast for this coming weekend matters so enormously. Because the very same warmth that shows up on your phone as a high temperature is, at the same moment, an invisible pump running across the entire dry region, drawing moisture up and out of the ground 24 hours a day. When we talk about a heat wave, we tend to think about human comfort, about how hot it will feel, about whether the air conditioning can keep up. But out on the land, a heat wave is something else entirely. It is a drought accelerant. It is the atmosphere turning up the suction on a countryside that is already running dry. Consider what is happening in the southwest as I record this. The National Weather Service has extreme heat warnings posted across Arizona and Southern California, and the numbers on them are severe. In the Phoenix metropolitan area, forecast highs of 111 to 116 degrees. Across the deserts of San Diego County, up to 117 degrees. In the Coachella Valley, up to 116. Down in the bottom of the Grand Canyon, at a place called Phantom Ranch, the warning runs for days with highs between 111 and 114 degrees. Now, every one of those numbers is a human danger, and the warnings are written to protect people. But every one of those numbers is also a measure of how hard the air is pulling water out of the ground across that entire region. At those temperatures, the evaporative demand is enormous. Any moisture left in the soil, any dampness in the vegetation, is being lifted away hour after hour under a cloudless sky. The heat is not a separate problem from the drought. The heat is the mechanism that makes the drought worse. And this is where the timing becomes genuinely ominous, because the heat that is over the southwest right now is not the peak. It is the opening act. The extended forecast from the Weather Prediction Center describes a broad zone of high pressure, a ridge, expanding over the central part of the country this coming weekend. Under that ridge, temperatures across the northern plains are expected to run 10 to 20 degrees above normal. Across the southeast, the forecast calls for major to locally extreme heat risk, with heat index values, the combination of temperature and humidity, reaching between 105 and 115 degrees. So the hottest, most widespread heat of the season so far is loading up to arrive precisely on top of a country that is already two-thirds dry, and it is going to do to the ground exactly what the physics predicts. It is going to reach down and pull the remaining moisture up and out faster than before over a wider area than before. Whatever marginal improvement that eastern rain provided last week, the evaporative demand of this weekend's heat is positioned to erase it. Let me put the whole idea in the plainest possible terms, because it reframes everything. A drought is not just the sky forgetting to rain. A drought is a tug of war between the water going into the ground and the water being pulled back out of it, and temperature controls the pulling. When the air warms, the pulling gets stronger, so a warming world does not simply mean hotter afternoons. It means that every drought that does occur runs deeper, lasts longer, and grips harder, because the atmosphere overhead has been handed a bigger straw. The same missing rain now produces a worse drought. That is not speculation. That is the 7% per degree law of Clausius-Clapeyron, playing out across two-thirds of a continent. This idea, that heat can drive a drought as powerfully as missing rain, has changed the way scientists even define the problem. For a long time, drought was measured almost entirely by rainfall deficits, by how far below normal the precipitation had fallen. But researchers kept noticing something that the rainfall-only view could not explain. Some of the most damaging droughts were happening in years when the rainfall deficit alone was not that severe, and what pushed them into catastrophe was the heat, the evaporative demand doing the extra work. So forecasters began tracking the thirst of the atmosphere as its own drought driver, building tools that map how strongly the air is pulling moisture from the land, independent of how much rain has fallen. And when they map that, they find that a warming climate has been steadily increasing that atmospheric thirst over the decades, meaning that droughts today arrive with a hotter, hungrier atmosphere on top of them than droughts of the past ever faced. The rain deficit may be similar to a drought 50 years ago. The evaporative demand is not. It is higher, and it is doing more damage per missing inch of rain than it used to. That is a genuinely important shift in understanding, and it reframes what we are watching. When people say a drought is worse than it used to be, or that fire seasons are more extreme than a generation ago, the instinct is to argue about whether it has rained less. But rainfall is only half the ledger, and often it is not even the half that changed the most. What changed is the temperature, and through it the thirst of the air. A hotter baseline means that even an ordinary rainfall shortfall now gets amplified into an extraordinary drought, because the atmosphere overhead is taking a bigger cut than it used to. This is the quiet, physics-level reason that the same kind of dry spell that a countryside might have shrugged off decades ago can now produce a fire that outruns every crew in the state. Nothing about the rock and the sky is different. What is different is how much water the warmer air pulls back out, and that difference is enough to change the outcome. Scientists have a way of putting an actual number on this thirst, and it is worth knowing because it is the quantity that really governs a countryside's drying. They call it the vapor pressure deficit, and the idea is simpler than the name. At any given temperature, the air can hold a certain maximum amount of water vapor. The vapor pressure deficit is the gap between how much water vapor the air is actually holding and that maximum it could hold. When the gap is large, the air is nowhere near full, so it pulls moisture in aggressively from anything wet. When the gap is small, the air is nearly saturated and can barely take on any more, so the pulling nearly stops. And here is the key. Because warm air can hold so much more vapor, warming the air widens that gap dramatically, even if the actual humidity does not change. A hot afternoon with low humidity produces a huge vapor pressure deficit, and a huge deficit is a countryside being wrung out like a sponge. This is exactly why a relative humidity reading of 10%, the number attached to that Utah fire warning, is so alarming. 10% humidity means the air is holding only a tenth of the water vapor it is capable of holding at that temperature. The deficit is enormous. Under that kind of air, every blade of grass, every pine needle, every square inch of soil is losing moisture as fast as physics allows. Add the wind that comes with those same fire weather setups, and you strip away the thin layer of slightly more humid air that clings to each surface and would otherwise slow the drying, replacing it constantly with fresh bone-dry air. Heat opens the deficit, low humidity widens it, and wind delivers it. That is the recipe, and it is written across the West this week. You can watch this same principle in miniature anytime you hang laundry out to dry. On a hot, dry, breezy afternoon, wet clothes are stiff and dry in an hour, because the thirsty air pulls the water out of them fast. On a cool, damp, still day, those same clothes can hang all afternoon and stay clammy, because the air is nearly full and has no room to take on more moisture. The land works exactly the same way. A hot, dry, windy day is the atmosphere hanging the entire countryside out to dry, pulling moisture from every surface as fast as the physics allows. And this week, across 2/3 of the countryside is on the line in exactly those conditions, day after day, with the strongest drying of the summer still to come this weekend. Living plants feel this before anything else, and their response actually deepens the problem in a cruel way. When the air gets this thirsty, plants try to protect themselves. They close the tiny pores on their leaves, the stomata, to stop losing water. That is a survival move, but it means the plant stops transpiring, stops releasing moisture into the air, and stops using the sun's energy for growth. So as the vapor pressure deficit climbs, the vegetation shuts down its own cooling, dries toward dormancy, and turns from a living moisture-holding thing into fuel. The same heat that pulls water from the soil also pushes the plants into the state where they will burn. It is the identical physics we walked through in the recent videos on the heat wave and on the limits of what the human body can survive, the 7% per degree relationship between temperature and the air's capacity for water. There, we watched it act on human skin and human sweat. Here, we are watching it act on an entire countryside, and the countryside has no air conditioning to retreat into. Let me make the whole thing concrete with a simple comparison, because it dissolves the myth that drought is only about rainfall. Imagine two identical stretches of grassland that each receive the exact same amount of rain in a given month. One of them sits under a cool, cloudy, humid month. The other sits under a hot, clear, dry month, like the one bearing down on the west right now. Same rain in, completely different outcome. The cool, humid stretch keeps most of its moisture because the thirsty air is not pulling hard. The hot, dry stretch loses far more of that same rainfall back to the sky before it can do any good, because the vapor pressure deficit is enormous and the pulling never stops. Same water delivered, and one field stays green while the other browns into kindling. That is the entire point. In a warming atmosphere, The rain you get matters less than it used to because the air takes more of it back. The drought is not only what the sky failed to give, it is what the heat is taking away, and the heat is winning. So now we know the scale, 2/3 of a country, and we know the engine, an increasingly thirsty atmosphere pulling moisture out of the ground faster than it goes in. But there is one more piece to this, and it is the piece that turns a bad drought into an escalating one. Because a drought does not just sit there and wait for rain. Under the right conditions, a drought actively makes itself worse. It creates the very heat that deepens it. It is a loop that feeds on its own output, and once you see how that loop works, you will understand why this situation is not stabilizing. It is spiraling. Part 4. The loop that feeds itself. Here is a question that sounds simple but hides something important. When the sun shines down on a piece of ground, where does all that energy go? The sunlight hits the surface, and that energy has to become something, and it turns out there are two main things it can become, and which one it becomes depends almost entirely on whether the ground is wet or dry. This single fork in the road is the reason a drought can accelerate itself, so let me walk through it carefully. When the sun's energy lands on moist ground, on soil with water in it, on a field of well-watered plants, a large share of that energy goes into evaporating the water. Turning liquid water into vapor takes an enormous amount of energy, and that is the point. The energy that goes into lifting water off the surface as vapor is energy that does not go into heating the air. Scientists call this latent heat, the energy hidden inside the process of evaporation. A wet countryside, in effect, spends the sun's energy on evaporation, and in doing so it cools itself and the air above it. It is the same reason sweat cools your skin. The evaporation carries the heat away. A moist countryside is a countryside that air conditions itself with its own water. Now take that same sunlight and shine it on dry ground, on soil that has no moisture left to give, on brown, dormant, water-starved vegetation. There is no water to evaporate, so the energy has nowhere to go except straight into heating. Instead of being spent lifting water into the air, the sun's energy goes directly into raising the temperature of the ground and the air just above it. Scientists call this sensible heat, the heat you can actually feel as temperature. A dry countryside cannot air condition itself because it has spent its water, so it just gets hot. Hotter than the wet countryside next door receiving the exact same sunlight. Now watch how those two facts lock together into a loop. A drought dries out the soil. The dry soil can no longer cool itself through evaporation, so the sun's energy goes into heating instead, and local temperatures climb. But we just learned, in the last part, what higher temperatures do. Higher temperatures increase the atmosphere's thirst, its evaporative demand, so the hotter air pulls even harder on whatever moisture remains in the ground. That pulls the soil drier still, and drier soil means even less evaporation, which means even more of the sun's energy goes into heat, which raises the temperature again, which increases the thirst of the air again, which dries the soil again. Around and around. Each turn of the loop makes the next turn worse. The drought creates heat, and the heat deepens the drought, and there is no natural break inside the cycle. This is what scientists mean when they talk about a drought-heat feedback. It is a machine that, once it gets going on a large enough scale, runs on its own output. This is a huge part of why the interior West in early July is such a dangerous setup. The soil across much of that region is already drained, so the land is already tilted toward pumping the sun's energy into heat rather than into evaporation, which is one of the reasons the southwest is running as hot as it is, and that extra heat is, in turn, reaching back into the ground and pulling out what little moisture is left. The region is not in a stable dry state. It is in a self-reinforcing dry state, sliding downhill under its own momentum, and the weekend heat dome is about to give the whole loop a hard shove. And now add fire to the picture, because fire is not just a consequence of this loop. Fire is a participant in it. When a fire like the one in Utah burns across a countryside, it strips away the vegetation, the grass and brush and canopy that would otherwise hold some moisture and cast some shade and slow the drying of the soil beneath. In the fire's wake it leaves bare, blackened, sun-exposed ground. That scorched surface absorbs sunlight even more efficiently than dry vegetation did, so it heats up even faster, and it holds no water to evaporate. The burned land becomes an even more efficient heat engine than the dry land it replaced, which warms the air a little more, which dries the surrounding country a little more, which primes the next fire. The drought feeds the fire and the fire feeds the drought, and both of them feed the heat. I want to be careful and honest here, because this channel does not deal in doom for its own sake. This feedback loop is not a doomsday device that runs forever until the country is a cinder. Loops like this get interrupted all the time, by a change in the weather pattern, by a front that finally delivers real rain, by the arrival of a wetter season, by the simple turning of the calendar toward autumn. The loop is not unbreakable. But, and this is the crucial but, nothing in the current data suggests it is about to break. The forecast does not show a pattern-busting rain event bearing down on the interior west. It shows the opposite. It shows a ridge of high pressure building in, which suppresses rain and cranks up the heat, which is precisely the input this loop feeds on. So for at least the coming days, the machine has fuel, and the machine is running, and the direction it is running is deeper into drought, not out of it. The reason a feedback loop is so much more dangerous than a simple problem is worth making explicit, because it changes how you should think about the trajectory. A one-time problem does damage, and then it is over. A feedback loop does damage that becomes the cause of more damage, so the effect grows with each cycle rather than fading. Think of the difference between pushing a boulder off a ledge once and setting a boulder rolling downhill. The first is a single event. The second gathers speed on its own, because each moment of falling makes the next moment faster. The drought-heat feedback is the boulder rolling downhill. The dryness produces heat, and the heat produces more dryness, and each turn of the cycle hands more momentum to the next. This is why a drought can seem to sit quietly for a while, and then deepen quickly, almost suddenly, once the loop gets rolling. The system was gathering speed the whole time, and the loop does not run in isolation. It runs on top of the ordinary daily rhythm of heating, which is why a stretch of clear, hot days is so effective at deepening a drought. Each day the sun rises on ground that is a little drier than the day before, so a little more of that day's energy goes into heat instead of evaporation. So the afternoon runs a little hotter, so the air that night is a little thirstier, so a little more moisture is gone by the next dawn. Repeat that over a week of a heat dome, and the compounding is substantial. It is the same reason a savings account grows faster the longer it compounds, except here it is running in reverse, a debt that grows faster the longer the dry heat persists. A single hot day barely moves the needle. A week or two of hot, dry, cloudless days under a stubborn ridge can drive a countryside from stress to critical, because the loss compounds on itself every single day the pattern holds. And a stubborn ridge is exactly what the forecast shows. Scientists actually measure the balance point of this fork in the road, the ratio of how much of the sun's energy goes into heating the air versus how much goes into evaporating water. Over a well-watered field, most of the energy goes into evaporation, and the temperature stays moderate. Over parched ground, that ratio flips, and most of the energy goes into raw heat. You can feel this yourself with a simple comparison. Walk across a green, irrigated lawn on a hot afternoon, and the air just above it feels noticeably cooler because the grass is transpiring, spending the sun's energy on evaporation and cooling itself in the process. Then walk across a bare dirt lot or a stretch of desert pavement a few feet away, and the heat radiating off it is punishing because that dry surface has no water to spend and dumps all of the sun's energy straight into temperature. Same sun, same afternoon, two completely different surfaces, and the only difference is water. Now scale that contrast up from a lawn and a lot to entire regions, and you understand why a drought-stricken countryside runs measurably hotter than a healthy one right beside it, and why that extra heat then reaches back to dry the land further. This is also the mechanism behind something meteorologists have come to watch with real concern, a phenomenon called flash drought. For most of history, we thought of droughts as slow to arrive, taking seasons to develop. But scientists have documented that under the right conditions, a combination of a sudden rain shutoff and a burst of intense heat, a drought can slam into a region in a matter of weeks rather than months, because the heat-driven evaporative demand strips the soil moisture so fast. The land can go from adequately moist to severely stressed, almost shockingly quickly, when the atmosphere turns hot and thirsty at the same time that the rain stops. A major flash drought struck the central United States earlier this decade and did billions of dollars in agricultural damage precisely because it developed faster than anyone expected. And the ingredients for that kind of rapid deepening hot air, high evaporative demand, and no incoming rain are exactly what the forecast is serving up for this weekend, on ground that is already dry to begin with. It helps to think of the whole thing as a triangle, 3 forces each feeding the other 2. At one corner is the drought, the dryness of the soil and the vegetation. At the second corner is the heat, the temperature of the land and the air. At the third corner is the fire. The drought feeds the heat, because dry ground converts sunlight to temperature instead of evaporation. The heat feeds the drought because warm air pulls moisture out faster. The drought feeds the fire because it dries the fuel. The fire feeds the heat and the drought because it strips the land bare and leaves scorched ground that heats faster and holds no water. Every side of the triangle pushes on the others, and when all 3 corners are active at once, as they are across the interior west right now, the whole structure reinforces itself, which is why a summer like this can produce records across all 3 categories at the same time: the driest conditions, the hottest temperatures, and the largest fires, each one helping to manufacture the others. They are not 3 separate bad luck events stacking up by coincidence. They are 3 faces of a single self-reinforcing system. Now, I promised I would be honest about the limits of this, so let me be specific about how the loop actually breaks, because it does break, and knowing how tells you what to watch for. The most common circuit breaker in the West is the summer monsoon, a seasonal shift that pulls moisture up from the south and can bring afternoon thunderstorms to the southwest, wetting the ground and interrupting the cycle, though those same storms can also bring dry lightning that starts new fires before the rain arrives. Another breaker is a strong weather front that finally pushes through with genuine soaking rain. Another is simply the calendar turning toward autumn, when the sun sits lower, the days shorten, and the evaporative demand naturally falls. Any of these can stop the loop. The problem is that none of them is in the forecast for the interior west in the immediate days ahead. What is in the forecast is the opposite, a ridge of high pressure, which is the very thing that suppresses rain and amplifies heat. The ridge does not break the loop. The ridge is the loop's best friend. So while the machine is not eternal, it currently has no off switch anywhere on the horizon, and it is being handed more fuel this weekend rather than less. This is the difference between a drought that is bad and a drought that is escalating, and it is the reason the word in the title of this is escalating. A static drought is a hardship. A self-reinforcing drought that is being handed a heat wave is something that builds on itself, and the fire in Utah, the one at 0% containment, is what it looks like when that building process reaches the point where the land can no longer resist ignition at all. The fire is the loop made visible, which is exactly where we need to go next, because I've been telling you the fire is a symptom, and now I want to show you, in detail, just how much of a symptom it really is, and why the way these fires are behaving is telling us something about the ground itself that no drought map can capture. Part 5. The drought made visible. Everything I have described so far, the 2/3 of the country, the thirsty air, the self-feeding loop, is happening silently and invisibly across the land. You cannot photograph evaporative demand. You cannot see soil moisture leaving the ground. But there is one place where all of it becomes visible at once, where the abstraction turns into something you can watch from a satellite, and that place is a wildfire. The fires burning across the west this week are the drought made visible. They are what it looks like when the ground gets dry enough that the abstract numbers on a drought map turn into flame. So let me show you the full picture of what is burning, because the Babylon fire, as dramatic as it is not alone. Start with Babylon itself, since it is the headline. 96,564 acres in southern Utah, 0% contained. Discovered June 26th. But look one line down the list and you find the Cottonwood fire, also in Utah, at 95,934 acres, nearly the same size, though crews have managed to get that one to 56% contained. Cross into Colorado, and there is the Aspen Acres fire, at 91,982 acres, only 13% contained. There is the Ferris fire, also in Colorado, over 51,000 acres, at 22%. There is the Gold Mountain fire, again in Colorado, at 29,000 acres, and only 2% contained. Down in Arizona, the Pocket fire, near 27,000 acres, and these are only the largest incidents. when a satellite system operated by NASA counted the active fire detections across the country over a single 24-hour period this week, it registered 935 separate hotspots. 935 points of active burning in one day. Now, some of those hotspots are small, agricultural, routine. That number is a texture, not a precise count of major fires, but the pattern in the large fires tells the real story, and the pattern is about containment. Look at the containment figures again. 0%, 2%, 13%, 22%. Those are the numbers of a firefighting system that is being outrun. When crews have decades of experience and the best equipment in the world, and they still cannot get a line around a fire, it is almost never because they stopped trying. It is because the fuel is behaving in a way that defeats the standard tactics. And what makes fuel behave that way is dryness. It comes back every single time to how much moisture is left in the grass and the brush and the timber, and right now, across the interior west, the answer is almost none. There is a concept firefighters use called fuel moisture, and it is exactly what it sounds like, the percentage of water contained in the vegetation that a fire might burn. When fuel moisture is high, a fire struggles. The flames have to boil the water out of each leaf and twig before it can burn, and that saps the fire's energy and slows its spread. When fuel moisture is low, the opposite happens. The vegetation ignites almost instantly, the fire releases its full energy immediately, and it races across the land faster than any crew can build a barrier ahead of it. A drought does not just make more fires start. A drought lowers the fuel moisture across an entire region, so that when a fire does start, it behaves like the Babylon fire, unstoppable, because the countryside has been pre-dried into kindling. The 0% containment figure is not really a statement about the fire. It is a statement about the ground. It is the drought, written in flame. Look across the whole cluster, and the containment numbers tell a consistent story. The fires that crews have managed to corral, the ones sitting at 94, 98, 100% contained, tend to be the ones that started earliest, before the worst of the current dryness and heat set in, or that burned in country where crews could get ahead of them. But the newer fires, the ones ignited into the teeth of this drought, are the ones stuck in the single digits and at 0. Babylon at 0%, Gold Mountain at 2%, Aspen Acres at 13. The pattern is not random, it tracks the worsening of the conditions. A fire is caught when crews can move faster than the flames, and right now, on the driest fuel, under the hottest and windiest skies, the flames are winning that race. The containment column, red top to bottom, is essentially a chart of how the fuel and the weather have deteriorated, written in the language of firefighting, and this week the atmosphere is doing everything it can to make that ground even more flammable. Across the West, the National Weather Service has posted a string of red flag warnings, which are the specific alerts that mean the weather conditions are primed for extreme fire behavior. In Utah, the warning cited relative humidity dropping as low as 10%, with wind gusts up to 30 miles per hour. Think about what 10% humidity means. The air is so dry that it is itself pulling moisture out of the vegetation, and then the wind arrives to fan any flame and carry embers ahead of the fire line. Idaho is under red flag warnings for dry thunderstorms, the kind that bring lightning to start new fires, but little rain to stop them. Eastern Washington is flagged for hot, dry, and breezy conditions. In total, more than a dozen red flag warnings are active across the country. The weather is not neutral this week. The weather is actively loading the gun. And here is a detail that should genuinely give you pause, because it shows how far the dry and hot pattern has spread. One of those red flag warnings is not in the desert southwest at all. It is in interior Alaska. The National Weather Service in Fairbanks posted fire weather warnings for the interior Seward Peninsula and the Yukon valleys, citing relative humidity dropping to 30% and highs approaching 80 degrees. Alaska. Fire weather serious enough to warrant a red flag warning, in a part of the world most people associate with permafrost and cold. That is how far north the hot, dry signal has reached this summer. When the fire weather map has warnings running from the Mojave Desert all the way up to the edge of the Arctic, you're not looking at a local problem, you're looking at a continental one. Behind every one of these fires are people, and it is worth remembering that the drought's most visible symptom is also its most immediately destructive one. A fire at 0% containment near populated country means evacuations, means families packing what they can into a car and leaving, means the agonizing uncertainty of not knowing whether a home will still be standing when they are allowed back. It means livestock moved or lost, businesses shuttered, roads closed, entire communities living under smoke for weeks. And it means firefighters, thousands of them, working in brutal heat against a fire that will not hold a line in some of the most dangerous conditions any job on Earth offers. When we reduce a fire to an acreage and a containment percentage, we lose sight of the fact that each of those acres is somebody's rangeland or watershed or backyard, and each percentage point of containment that will not climb is a night that someone spends not knowing if they still have a home. The drought is abstract, the fire it produces is not, and the reach of these fires extends far beyond the flame front through the smoke. When this many large fires burn at once, they loft enormous plumes of smoke that ride the winds for hundreds of miles, degrading air quality in cities that may never see a spark. That is why, alongside all the fire and heat warnings this week, there are also numerous air quality alerts posted across multiple states. The smoke carries fine particles that lodge far down in the lungs, and it turns a fire in the Utah desert into a health hazard for people in states downwind who have no idea their hazy sky and their scratchy throat trace back to a drought-fueled fire hundreds of miles away. So even the people who are nowhere near the flames are breathing the drought this week, in the most literal sense possible. The symptom does not stay where the disease is, it spreads on the wind. It is worth understanding fuel moisture a little more deeply, because it is not one number but several, and the drought attacks all of them at once. Firefighters divide the fuel on a countryside by how quickly it responds to changes in the weather. The finest fuels, the grasses and the small twigs react within about an hour, drying out or moistening up almost as fast as the air around them. Larger material, the branches and the downed limbs, takes longer, days rather than hours, and the heaviest fuels, the logs and the dense duff on the forest floor, can take weeks or months to fully dry. In a normal year, even a hot spell only dries out the finest fuels, while the heavier material stays damp enough to slow a fire down. But in a sustained drought like this one, the dryness reaches all the way down. The fine fuels are tinder, yes, but the heavy fuels have also given up their moisture over the long dry months. So once a fire gets going, it does not just flash through the grass, it gets into the heavy timber and the buried ground fuels that would normally resist it, and that is what lets a fire burn with the intensity and the staying power to defeat containment. The whole fuel bed, top to bottom, has been pre-dried by the drought. That is the difference between a fire that crews can catch and a fire like Babylon that they cannot. The behaviour that results is what makes these fires so dangerous and so hard to fight. When every layer of fuel is dry, a fire can climb from the grass into the brush and up into the crowns of the trees, becoming what is called a crown fire, racing through the tops of the forest, where no ground crew can reach it. It throws burning embers, called firebrands, far ahead of the main front, and those embers land in fuel so dry that they ignite instantly, starting spot fires that grow and merge. A fire like this does not advance as a neat line you can draw a barrier in front of. It advances as a shower of embers landing in a tinderbox, jumping roads and rivers and the very control lines crews are trying to build. That is how you get to 0% containment. The fire is not respecting the edges, because the fuel on both sides of every edge is equally ready to burn. And the drought does not just make one fire worse, it makes many fires happen at once, and that creates a second-order problem that rarely gets discussed. When a dozen large fires are burning across Utah, Colorado, Arizona, and beyond at the same time, they are all competing for the same finite pool of resources, the same aircraft, the same hotshot crews, the same engines and bulldozers and supervisors. There are only so many air tankers in the country. There are only so many trained crews. When the whole West is alight at once, as it is now, those resources have to be rationed, and a fire that might be catchable if it had the nation's full attention instead gets a fraction of what it needs, because 10 other fires need the same thing on the same afternoon. The drought manufactures simultaneity, and simultaneity overwhelms the system. That is a hidden cost of a continental dryout that you will never see on a drought map, and it is part of why these fires grow the way they do. I mentioned the fire warning in Alaska, and I want to come back to it for a moment because it is genuinely significant, not just a curiosity. The far north is not supposed to be fire country in the way the desert southwest is, but the northern forests and tundra, when they do dry out and burn, hold enormous amounts of carbon in their soils, and fires there can smoulder in the ground in ways that are extraordinarily hard to extinguish. A red flag warning for interior Alaska, with humidity dropping toward 30%, is a sign that the hot, dry pattern this summer is not confined to the usual suspects. It has stretched the fire weather footprint from the Mojave Desert to the edge of the Arctic Circle, which is about as wide a span as the country has to offer, and all of that burning produces smoke, which is why, layered on top of the fire warnings and the heat warnings this week, there are also air quality alerts, more than a dozen of them, as the smoke from all these fires drifts across states and degrades the air far from any flame. The drought's reach extends past the fire line into the lungs of people who may live hundreds of miles from the nearest burning acre. So let me connect this all the way back to where we started, because this is the whole point of showing you the fires in this much detail. Every one of these numbers, the 96,000 acres, the 0%, the 10% humidity, the 935 hotspots, the red flag warnings from Utah to Alaska, is not really a story about fire. It is a story about water, or rather the absence of it. The fires are the most visible, most photogenic, most attention-grabbing symptom of the drought, and precisely because they are so dramatic, they steal all the attention from the disease underneath. We look at the flames and we say, what a terrible fire season. And we miss the fact that the fire season is this bad because 2/3 of the country is dry and the fuel moisture has collapsed across an entire region. The fire is the drought, made visible, made urgent, made impossible to ignore for one news cycle before we look away. And the drought will still be there, escalating long after this particular fire is out. Which brings us to the force that is about to make all of it worse, the one arriving this weekend, the accelerant with a forecast attached. Part 6. The accelerant arriving this weekend. I have mentioned the coming heat a few times now, and always as a threat on the horizon. It is time to look straight at it, because the heat that is loading up for this weekend is not a separate weather story running alongside the drought. It is the same story. It is the accelerant, and it is arriving on schedule, and understanding exactly what it is going to do requires connecting it directly back to that thirsty air physics we covered earlier. The heat and the drought are one machine viewed from two angles, and this weekend the machine gets a fresh tank of fuel. Here is what the forecast actually says. The Weather Prediction Center, in its extended outlook, describes a large dome of high pressure, a ridge, building and expanding over the central United States as the weekend arrives. Under a ridge like that, the air sinks, the sky is clear, and the sun beats down uninterrupted, and the result is heat that builds day after day because there is no weather to break it up. The forecast puts temperatures across the northern plains at 10 to 20 degrees above normal this weekend. Across the southeast it calls for major to locally extreme heat risk, with heat index values, the way the air actually feels once you fold in the humidity, climbing to between 105 and 115 degrees, and this is on top of the extreme heat already baked into the southwest, where, as I mentioned, Phoenix is looking at highs up to 116 degrees, the deserts of Southern California up to 117. Now, most weather coverage will present those numbers purely as a human safety story, and that framing is completely valid. Heat is the deadliest form of weather in the United States, deadlier than hurricanes, deadlier than tornadoes, and these are dangerous, potentially lethal temperatures for anyone without reliable cooling. That warning is real and worth repeating. But I want you to hold the other meaning of those numbers in your mind at the same time, the meaning we built in the earlier parts. Every one of those temperatures is also a measurement of how hard the atmosphere is about to pull water out of the ground. When the northern plains run 20 degrees above normal, the evaporative demand across that region does not rise by 20 degrees worth. Because of that 7% per degree relationship, the thirst of the air rises sharply, and it does so over a huge area, and it does so for days on end. The scale of who is affected is part of what makes this weekend so serious. A heat dome of this size does not touch one city, it settles over huge stretches of the country at once, which means the heat and its danger are shared by tens of millions of people simultaneously. Across the southwest that is already baking, the northern plains where temperatures are set to run 10 to 20 degrees above normal, and the southeast where the heat index is forecast to climb toward 115. When a single weather feature endangers that many people across that wide an area, the strain lands everywhere at once. On the power grid as air conditioners run flat out, on emergency services, on everyone without reliable cooling. And underneath all of it, invisible beneath the human story, The same dome is drying the land across that entire footprint in every one of those regions at the same time. The heat wave is a continental event, and so is the drying it drives. So picture what this weekend actually does to the map we have been building. You have a country that is already 2/3 dry, you have an interior west already locked in that self-reinforcing drought-heat loop, already pumping the sun's energy into temperature instead of evaporation because the soil has nothing left to give. And now, over the top of all of it, you slide a continental heat dome that drives temperatures 10 to 20 degrees above normal and cranks the atmosphere's thirst up across the northern plains, the southeast, and the already scorched southwest all at once. The heat dome is not going to start the drought. The drought is already here. The heat dome is going to deepen it by reaching into whatever moisture is left in the soil and the vegetation and lifting it away faster than at any point so far this summer. And remember that small improvement in the national drought number from last week, the one driven by eastern rain. This is the mechanism that erases it. A week ago, some rain fell and soaked into the ground in parts of the east, and the drought category improved slightly. But soil moisture is not permanent. It sits there until the atmosphere pulls it back out, and evaporative demand is exactly the force that does the pulling. A heat dome parked over the eastern and central states does not just make people uncomfortable. It reaches down into that recently wetted soil, and it draws the moisture back up into the sky, undoing the gain. So the very heat that is about to endanger tens of millions of people is also, at the level of the land, about to reverse the one piece of good news the drought map offered. The improvement was a loan, the heat is the repayment coming due, and the timing of it, at this exact point in the year, is what makes it so consequential. This is early July. The strongest heat of a typical summer usually arrives in the second half of July and into August, which means the season still has its most intense stretch ahead of it. So the country is not being handed this heat dome at the tail end of the dry season, when relief might be near. It is being handed it near the front end, with the hottest weeks still to come and the drought already this advanced. Every increment of drying that this weekend's heat accomplishes is drying that the rest of the summer will build upon, not recover from. The land does not reset between heat waves in a drought year. It carries the accumulated deficit forward, and each new dome of heat starts from a drier baseline than the last. That is why a heat event in early July, on ground already 2/3 dry, is not just a bad weekend. It is a foundation for whatever the rest of the summer decides to do, and it is being poured now, while the deepest heat has not even arrived. There is a cruel efficiency to how well this all fits together. The drought dries the soil, which makes the region hotter, which increases the heat, which deepens the drought. And now the seasonal pattern delivers a heat dome right on cue, at the peak of summer, to press down on all of it at once. It is the same physics I described in the abstract, the Clausius-Clapeyron relationship, the sensible versus latent heat split, the feedback loop, except this weekend it stops being abstract and becomes a specific forecast, with specific numbers over specific cities. 116 in Phoenix, 117 in the California deserts, 10 to 20 above normal across the plains, heat index to 115 in the southeast. Every one of those is a human danger and a drought accelerant at the same time. Before we get into the mechanics, it is worth being clear-eyed about how serious this heat is on its own terms, apart from the drought, because it is the deadliest weather there is. Heat kills more people in the United States in an average year than hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods, and it does so quietly, often among the elderly, the isolated, and those without reliable cooling, in ways that rarely make a dramatic headline. This week the warnings are extensive. Nearly 200 separate weather alerts are active across the country, and among them are extreme heat warnings and heat advisories covering large populations across the southwest, and, as the weekend approaches, expanding into the plains and the southeast. When the forecast talks about heat index values reaching 115 degrees, it is describing conditions under which the human body cannot shed heat fast enough to stay safe for long, especially when the nights refuse to cool. So before this is a drought accelerant, it is a direct threat to human life, and the warnings are written to save people. Take them seriously, check on the vulnerable, and treat this heat as the hazard it is. But hold both meanings of the heat in your mind at once, because that is the entire point of this section. The same heat that endangers people is, at the level of the land, the force deepening the drought. Every person sweltering under a 115-degree heat index this weekend is standing on ground that is losing its moisture to that very same heat at the very same time. The human danger and the land danger are not two stories. They are one temperature, doing two kinds of damage simultaneously, to the people and to the water beneath them. And that is why a heat wave is never just a heat wave in a drought year. It is the drought's most powerful ally, arriving in the form the news knows how to cover, while the deeper damage it does to the water goes almost entirely unmentioned. It is worth understanding why a heat dome produces such extreme, persistent heat, because the mechanism is the same reason it also suppresses the rain that could break the drought. A dome of high pressure is in essence a mountain of heavy sinking air. As that air sinks from high in the atmosphere toward the surface, it gets compressed by the higher pressure below, and compressing air heats it up, the same way a bicycle pump warms as you press down on it. So the descending air under a ridge warms as it sinks, and it arrives at the surface hotter than it started. That sinking motion also flattens out clouds and shoves storm systems away around the edges of the dome, which is why the skies under a heat ridge are relentlessly clear. Clear skies mean the sun beats down without interruption, day after day, and the heat compounds because nothing comes along to break it. So a heat dome does two things at once that both feed the drought. It bakes the surface with compressed, sinking, cloudless heat, and it blocks the rain from arriving. It is not a coincidence that the driest regions and the hottest regions are the same regions. The same high-pressure ridge creates both. There is a particularly insidious detail in how these heat events work now, and it concerns the nights. In a healthy pattern, the land sheds much of its heat after dark, temperatures fall, and in the early morning a little dew can even form, giving the surface a brief moisture recovery. But under an intense heat dome, especially over dry ground, the nights stop cooling off the way they should. The overnight low temperatures stay elevated, sometimes dramatically so, and the land never gets its nighttime break. For people, this is the single most dangerous feature of a modern heat wave because the human body relies on cool nights to recover, and when the nights stay hot, heat stress accumulates day over day and the death toll climbs. But for the land, the hot nights matter too because they mean the drying does not pause at sundown. The evaporative demand keeps running through the night, and the small nightly moisture recovery that a cooler pattern would provide simply never happens. The ground is being wrung out around the clock. Let me put a concrete image on what this weekend does to the water itself. Picture a reservoir in the interior west, one of the storage lakes that supplies water to farms and cities through the dry season. Every hot, dry, windy day, that reservoir loses water straight off its surface into the thirsty air as vapour, and the hotter and drier the air, the faster it goes. A major heat event parked over the region for days does not just threaten people on land. It lifts a measurable depth of water off the top of every open reservoir in its footprint. Water that was being counted on for the months ahead. Water that is simply gone into the sky. So when a heat dome sits over a drought region, it attacks the water supply on every front at once. It pulls moisture from the soil, it pulls it from the vegetation, and it pulls it directly off the surface of the reservoirs that are supposed to be the region's savings account. And remember, this is happening to a region that is already drawing down that savings account faster than it can be refilled. That is why the small improvement in the drought number last week is so fragile. Soil moisture is not money in a vault, it is money sitting out in the wind. The eastern rain that improved the national figure put some water into the ground, but it will only stay there until the atmosphere reclaims it, and a continental heat dome is the atmosphere reclaiming it at maximum speed, over a huge area for days on end. So the very same heat event that is about to endanger tens of millions of people, the event that will fill the headlines this weekend, is at the same moment positioned to erase the one hopeful number the drought monitor produced, and then keep going, pushing the balance deeper into deficit. What looked like recovery was a short-term loan, and the heat is the collection notice. So when you see the heat wave hit the headlines this weekend, and it will, I want you to see what is actually underneath it. It is not a separate event from the fire in Utah and the 2/3 of the country that is drying out. It is the same continental drought, viewed through the lens of temperature, reaching its most dangerous moment of the summer so far. The heat is the drought's accelerant, and this weekend the accelerant arrives. But even this, the fires and the heat and the loop, is only the current chapter of something with a much longer history, and if you want to know where a drought like this can actually go, you have to look at the times it has happened before and at the enormous force sitting out in the Pacific Ocean that is quietly tilting the odds for the rest of the year. Part 7. The Rhyme of History and the Ocean. A drought this large is not a new thing under the sun. America has been here before, and the times it has been here are among the most consequential chapters in the country's history. So before we talk about where this goes, it is worth standing in the shadow of the droughts that came before, because they tell us what an escalating dryout is capable of becoming, and they help separate the honest concern from the overblown fear. This is the passing reference part of the story, the historical and oceanic context, but every piece of it points straight back to the drought we are living through right now. Start with the one that lives deepest in the American memory, the Dust Bowl. In the 1930s, a multi-year drought settled over the southern plains, and combined with farming practices that had stripped the native grasses that held the soil in place, it produced one of the worst environmental catastrophes in the nation's history. The topsoil, dried to powder, lifted into the sky in enormous black clouds that buried farms and towns and drove hundreds of thousands of people off their land. When scientists went back decades later to understand what had caused the underlying drought, researchers, in work published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, traced it to patterns of ocean temperature in the Pacific and Atlantic that shifted the storm tracks away from the plains. We talked about this in detail in the video from late April on the same conditions that built the Dust Bowl returning to America, so I will not reteach the whole mechanism here. The point for today is simpler and sharper. The Dust Bowl is proof that a drought, given enough time and the wrong conditions, can reorganize an entire society. It is the historical ceiling on what the slow disaster can do. And the ingredients that fed it, dry soil, ocean patterns steering the rain away, land pushed past its limits, are not relics. They are the same categories of force at work today, on a countryside that is now, on top of everything else, warmer than the 1930s ever were. Then there is an older and darker analogue, and it reaches beyond America's borders. Back in the 1870s, one of the most powerful climate events in recorded history gripped the planet, and it was driven by a warm phase in the Pacific Ocean, the same phenomenon we now call El Niño. When that Pacific warming reached an extreme, it shifted rainfall away from enormous regions of the world at once, and the result was a series of simultaneous droughts and famines across multiple continents that killed, by the estimates of the historians who have studied it, on the order of tens of millions of people. We covered that catastrophe in the video from April on the last time an El Niño looked like this. I raise it again now not to predict a famine, because the modern world is a very different place with very different defences, but to make one specific point. The reason I keep mentioning El Niño alongside this drought is that the Pacific Ocean is historically one of the master switches for where drought falls on this planet, and that master switch is right now in a meaningful position. Here is the state of that ocean. The index scientists use to track El Niño, which measures the temperature of a key patch of the Pacific, currently sits at plus 0.98. That is squarely in El Niño territory, in the moderate range, and the trend is still warming. But the more remarkable thing is how fast the ocean got here. Rewind about a year and a half, and that same index was at minus 0.54. It was in La Niña territory, a cool Pacific. Then, season by season, it climbed, minus 0.37, minus 0.14, plus 0.13, plus 0.51, and now plus 0.98, 6 consecutive seasons of steady warming, a full swing from a cool Pacific to a moderate El Niño in roughly 18 months. The sea surface temperature in that key region now sits near 29 degrees Celsius. The ocean has flipped, and it has flipped in the direction that, historically, reorganizes global rainfall. Now, I want to be careful and precise here, because this is exactly the kind of thing that gets oversold. An El Niño does not deterministically mean drought for any specific place. Its effects on any given region are tendencies, not guarantees, and they play out differently in the developing phase versus the peak. But on the whole, a strengthening El Niño arriving on top of an already warmed planet tilts the odds, and for parts of the interior and southern United States, it tends to tilt them toward a hotter, drier back half of the year, so the ocean is not causing the fire in Utah today. But the ocean is quietly loading the dice for the months ahead, and it is loading them in the direction the drought is already heading. And beneath all of this, beneath the fires and the heat and the surface soil, there is one more layer that almost never makes the news, and it connects directly back to the human stakes of a drought. Underneath much of the American West and the plains lie enormous reserves of groundwater, aquifers, water stored in rock over thousands of years. The largest of them, the Ogallala, stretches beneath the Great Plains and has watered American agriculture for generations. When a surface drought hits, farmers and communities lean harder on that underground water to make up the difference, pumping more of it to the surface. The problem is that in many places this water is being drawn down far faster than nature can refill it, and a prolonged surface drought accelerates that drawdown. And here is the quiet danger. None of that shows up on a weekly drought map. The drought monitor measures the surface. It does not measure the reservoir under your feet slowly being emptied. So when we talk about a drought escalating, we are often only seeing the top layer of a much deeper, much slower withdrawal, one that will still be draining long after the surface gets its next rain. Drought has a longer and darker resume than most people realise, and it is worth naming, because it puts the stakes of an escalating dry out in their true historical frame. When scientists and historians reconstruct the collapses of ancient societies, drought appears again and again as the force that pushed them over the edge. Prolonged droughts have been tied to the unravelling of civilizations across the ancient world, from the American Southwest to the Middle East to Asia, societies that thrived for centuries, and then, when the rains failed for long enough, could no longer feed themselves and came apart. Drought is not a minor entry in the catalogue of disasters. It is arguably the natural force that has toppled more human societies than any other, precisely because it attacks the one thing no society can do without: a reliable supply of water for its crops and its people. We tend to rank hurricanes and earthquakes as the great destroyers because they are violent and sudden. But over the long span of history, it is the slow disaster, the drought, that has ended the most. The reason the Pacific Ocean keeps appearing in these stories is that it is, in a real sense, the master switch for global rainfall, and it has been for as long as there have been continents and oceans. The distribution of warm and cool water across the tropical Pacific helps determine where the great engines of rising raining air set up and where the sinking drying air sits instead. When that distribution shifts, as it does during an El Niño, the rain shifts with it, and regions that counted on their seasonal rains can suddenly find those rains falling into the ocean instead of onto their fields. The 1870s famine, the Dust Bowl, and countless droughts before recorded history all trace back in part to the state of that ocean. So when I tell you that the Pacific Index has swung from a cool phase to a moderate warm phase over the past 6 seasons and is still climbing, I'm not offering a piece of trivia. I'm telling you that the single most powerful lever over where drought falls on this planet has been moving steadily in one direction for a year and a half, and it is not done moving yet. It is worth sitting with the Dust Bowl for a moment longer, because the human scale of it is what makes it a warning rather than a statistic. On a single day in April of 1935, a day people afterward called Black Sunday, a wall of dust rose over the southern plains that turned midday into total darkness. People described not being able to see their own hands in front of their faces. The dried topsoil of an entire region had lifted into the sky. Over the course of that decade, the drought and the dust drove something like 2.5 million people off the land, one of the largest migrations in American history. Families abandoning farms that could no longer feed them and heading west in search of anything. That is what a drought is capable of when it is allowed to run long enough on ground that has been pushed past its limits. And the sobering part, the part that connects directly to today, is that the underlying driver of that catastrophe was traced back to the same category of force now sitting in the Pacific, patterns of ocean temperature reorganizing where the rain would fall. The ocean wrote the Dust Bowl, and the ocean is talking again. So let me explain, in plain terms, how an ocean thousands of miles away reaches into the middle of a continent and moves the rain, because it is the mechanism that ties the 1870s and the 1930s to right now. Across the tropical Pacific, the trade winds normally blow from east to west, piling up warm surface water on the western side of the ocean, near Asia and Australia, and leaving cooler water in the east near South America. That warm pool in the west is where the air rises and the great tropical thunderstorms form, and that rising and sinking of air sets up an enormous looping circulation that helps organize weather patterns around much of the globe. During an El Niño, the trade winds weaken, and that warm pool of water sloshes eastward across the Pacific. When the warmest water moves, the zone of rising air and heavy rain moves with it, and that shift ripples outward through the atmosphere, nudging the jet streams and the storm tracks off their normal paths. Rain that would have fallen in one place falls somewhere else, or does not fall at all. That is how a warm patch of ocean becomes a drought on another continent. It does not carry the dryness across the sea. It rearranges the whole atmospheric machine that decides where the rain goes. There is an important subtlety about how an El Niño delivers its effects, and it is the reason I keep hedging rather than making a flat prediction. The influence of a warm Pacific is not evenly spread through the year, and it is not the same in the developing phase as it is at the peak. Right now, in early summer, the El Niño is still building, and its fingerprints on any given region are relatively light and easily overwhelmed by local weather. Its strongest, most organised effects on North American weather tend to arrive later, through the fall and into the winter, when the event reaches its peak and the atmosphere has had time to lock into the pattern the ocean is setting. So the drought and fires we are seeing today are not primarily the El Niño's doing. They are the product of the immediate heat and dryness. The El Niño is the longer game, the force that will be shaping the odds through the back half of the year, when it matters most and when it is strongest. And there is the matter of the baseline, which is what makes every modern comparison to the past uneasy. The El Niño events of the 1870s and the droughts of the 1930s unfolded on a cooler planet than the one we live on now. Today's warm Pacific sits on top of a global temperature baseline that is meaningfully higher than any of those historical analogues faced, which means the same ocean pattern now arrives with more heat in the system, more evaporative demand, and a thirstier atmosphere than the historical versions ever had. So when we reach for the Dust Bowl, or the 1870s as a comparison, we have to remember that the modern version comes with an amplifier attached that the originals did not have. The ocean switch is the same. The world it is flipping is hotter. And the index that tracks that warm patch, as I said, now reads plus 0.98 and is still climbing, having risen for 6 straight seasons out of La Niña territory. That does not doom any specific town to drought, because the effects are tendencies and they unfold differently as the event matures. But it does mean the master switch is set in a position that, historically, has been associated with drier and hotter conditions across parts of the interior and southern United States, especially as an El Niño strengthens toward its winter peak. The ocean is not the cause of today's fire. The ocean is the thing quietly adjusting the odds for every month between now and the end of the year, and it is adjusting them in the direction the land is already heading. And beneath even the reservoirs and the rivers lies that deepest layer I want to make sure you do not forget, the groundwater. The great aquifers under the plains in the west, the Ogallala chief among them, hold water that in many places is thousands of years old, laid down over geological time and recharged by nature at an agonizingly slow rate, sometimes an inch or less per year. When a surface drought hits, the demand on that ancient water spikes, because it is the backup supply, and in many regions it is already being pumped out far faster than it can ever refill. So a drought does not just empty the visible water, the soil and the streams and the lakes. It accelerates the draining of an underground reserve that took millennia to fill, and once gone, does not come back on any timescale that matters to us. That is the part of the story that is truly hidden, because it happens entirely out of sight, below the ground, invisible to every satellite and every drought map, and it is the part that will still be unfolding long after the next rain has greened the surface and everyone has stopped paying attention. So the history rhymes, and the ocean is tilted, and the invisible reserve is being drawn down, and every one of those threads runs back to the same trunk. This is not the first time America has faced an escalating drought. The Dust Bowl proved how far it can go. This is not the first time the Pacific has quietly steered the rain. The 1870s proved how global that steering can be. And the water beneath the ground is a reminder that the drought we can measure is only the visible portion of a larger withdrawal. All of it deepens the same conclusion. The dryout spreading across the country right now is not an isolated bad summer. It is the current expression of some of the most powerful forces on the planet, working on a countryside that is hotter and thirstier than any of the historical analogues faced. Which leaves one last question, the one that matters most, and it is the question almost no one in the mainstream is actually asking out loud. Part 8. What no one is saying. Let me come back to the phrase in the title of this, the part that says no one is talking about it, because I want to be precise about what I mean, and I want to be fair. It is not that no one has ever mentioned the drought. Meteorologists track it. The fires make the news. What I mean is something more specific and honestly more troubling. The story is being told in the wrong pieces. We talk about the fire as a fire. We talk about the heat wave as a heat wave. We talk about the water restrictions as a local inconvenience. Each piece gets its own separate news cycle, and then it fades, and almost no one steps back to say these are not separate stories. They are one story. They are all the same continental drought, showing up in different costumes, and the reason it stays invisible is that we never assemble the pieces into the whole. That is the thing no one is saying. Not that the drought is secret, that it is being hidden in plain sight, scattered across a dozen headlines that never get added together. And this is exactly the void that gets filled with the wrong explanations. So let me address those directly, because whenever a drought and a fire outbreak hit at the same time, a familiar set of theories starts circulating, and this channel believes the honest thing to do is to look at them squarely rather than pretend they do not exist. The most common is the idea that the drought or the fires are being deliberately engineered, that some agency or hidden hand is manufacturing the dryness or igniting the flames, often with a facility like the high-frequency research station some people call by its initials, or through cloud seeding, or through some other form of weather modification. I understand the instinct behind this. When something this large and this destructive is unfolding, and the official explanation feels scattered and inadequate, it is natural to look for an author, someone who did this on purpose. But the physics simply does not allow it, and the numbers are not close. Consider the energy involved. A continental drought pattern, a ridge of high pressure parked over a third of a country, involves an amount of atmospheric energy so enormous that it dwarfs anything human technology can inject into the sky, by many orders of magnitude. A research facility running on a few megawatts of power is not in the same universe as the energy budget of a heat dome. It is like arguing that someone rearranged the ocean's tides by throwing a stone into the sea. And cloud seeding, the actual real technology that exists, can only do one narrow thing. It can encourage clouds that are already present, already full of moisture, to release some of that moisture a little sooner. It cannot conjure a drought. It cannot remove water from an entire continent. In fact, cloud seeding is a tool used to try to make it rain more, not less. The technology to engineer a drought across 2/3 of a country does not exist, and the energy it would require is not something any nation possesses. The drought is not authored. It is physics. There is a second theory that deserves a more sympathetic hearing because it contains a real kernel of truth. It is the idea that the authorities are hiding how bad the water situation truly is. Now, the strong version of that claim, deliberate concealment, does not hold up. The drought monitor is public. Reservoir levels are public. Stream flow gauges are public. The data is all right there for anyone to read. But the softer version of the claim points at something genuine. The slow, grinding depletion of the aquifers I mentioned, the long-term decline of the great reservoirs, the deeper water story, is genuinely undercovered relative to how important it is. Not because anyone is hiding it, but because it is slow and boring and does not photograph well, and our entire attention system is built to look at the fire and away from the falling water table. So the people who feel like the real story is being buried are, in a sense, onto something. The story is being buried, not by a conspiracy, but by the nature of slow disasters and short attention spans. The truth is more mundane than a cover-up and, in a way, more unsettling, because there is no villain to blame, only our collective inability to keep our eyes on something that moves this slowly. And then there is the mirror image claim, the one that says all of this is overblown, that the maps are exaggerated, that it's just a dry year like any other, that people have always panicked about drought, and the rain always comes back. And here, too, honesty requires meeting it halfway. It is true that the West has always had dry years. It is true, as I said at the very start, that the national severe drought number actually improved slightly last week. Anyone telling you this is unprecedented in every possible measure is overselling. But the full context, the soil moisture, the collapsed fuel moisture driving 0% containment, the 6-season swing in the Pacific, and above all the added heat that intensifies the evaporative demand on top of everything, shows a genuine escalation, not a fabrication. The honest position is not it is the apocalypse, and it is not it is nothing. The honest position is that this is a large, real, self-reinforcing drought being handed a heatwave, and dismissing it is as much a mistake as catastrophizing it. And notice what all three of those responses have in common. the engineered drought theory, the cover-up theory, and the it is all exaggerated theory. Every one of them is a way of avoiding the actual harder truth, which is that no single villain is responsible and no single reassurance is available. There is no secret author to blame and no authority hiding the ball, and there is also no comfort in pretending it is nothing. There is only physics, operating at continental scale, on a countryside that is dry and getting drier, under an atmosphere that is warm and getting thirstier. That is a harder thing to hold in your mind than a conspiracy or a dismissal, because it does not offer anyone to be angry at, and it does not let you off the hook. It just asks you to see the system clearly and take it seriously. And that, more than any theory, is what tends to be in short supply when a disaster moves this slowly. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a country where 2 out of every 3 parts of the land are drying out, where nearly a third is in severe drought or worse, where the driest region is getting drier even as a national average offers false comfort, where a fire has already outrun every crew sent at it because the ground itself has been turned to kindling, where the atmosphere is growing thirstier by the degree and a heat dome is loading up to make it thirstier still this very weekend, where a drought-heat feedback loop is running with no break in sight, and where the great Pacific switch that has steered drought across this planet for all of recorded history has quietly clicked into a warming position for the months ahead. There is one more reason these theories find such willing audiences, and it is worth naming with some compassion rather than contempt, because the people drawn to them are usually responding to something real. When a disaster this large unfolds and the official story arrives in scattered, technical, oddly bloodless pieces, a fire report here, a drought percentage there, a bureaucratic statement somewhere else, it can feel like no one is really telling you the truth, like the full picture is being withheld. And in a strange way, that feeling is not entirely wrong. The full picture is not being told, not because anyone is hiding it, but because our whole system of attention is built to deliver fragments and never the whole. So people reach for an explanation that at least treats the thing as a single, intentional, coherent story, even if that story is that someone did it on purpose. The impulse to find an author is really an impulse to find coherence, to feel that the pieces add up to something. The honest answer is that they do add up to something, a single continental drought, but the author is physics, not a person, and the reason it feels hidden is not conspiracy, but the simple fact that slow, large, quiet disasters are the hardest kind for human beings to see. That's why I think the most useful thing this channel can do with a story like this is exactly what we have done here, which is to refuse to let it stay in fragments, to take the fire and the 2/3 of the country and the thirsty air and the feedback loop and the heat dome and the ocean and the aquifer and set them all down next to each other so you can see that they are not 7 stories but 1. Because once you have seen it whole, you cannot unsee it. You will watch the heat wave hit the news this weekend and you will know what it is doing to the ground. You will see the next fire and you will understand what its containment number is really telling you about the fuel. You will hear that the drought improved by some fraction of a percent, and you will know to ask, improved where and at what cost somewhere else. Seeing it whole is the entire defense against a slow disaster, because the one thing a slow disaster relies on is that you will never quite assemble the pieces. We just assembled them. I want to spend a moment on the stakes, because it is easy to talk about drought in the abstract, in percentages and indices, and lose sight of what it actually does to people's lives. Water is not just something we drink. It is the foundation underneath nearly everything. A huge share of the nation's food is grown in exactly the regions now under the deepest drought. And when the water runs short, farmers face brutal choices, letting fields go fallow, tearing out orchards that took decades to grow, selling off cattle they can no longer water. Those choices ripple outward into the price of food on every grocery shelf in the country, far from any drought map. Drought is one of the few natural disasters whose bill arrives quietly, months later, in the form of higher costs for things everyone buys. And in the West, water is bound up in a century of law and rights and allocation agreements that were mostly written in wetter times, which means that as the water shrinks, the fights over who gets what intensify, between cities and farms, between states, between everyone who was promised a share of rivers that no longer carry as much as they were promised to carry. A severe enough drought does not just dry the land, it strains the agreements that hold the region together. So what should you actually watch for in the days and weeks ahead, now that you can see the whole machine? Watch the containment numbers on these fires, because they are a live readout of the fuel condition. If containment stays stuck near zero even as crews pour in, that is the drought telling you the fuel moisture has not budged. Watch for the arrival, or the failure, of the southwestern monsoon, because that seasonal moisture is the most likely thing that could interrupt the loop, and its timing and strength will shape the rest of the summer. Watch the next weekly drought map after this weekend's heat, because if I am right about evaporative demand, that eastern improvement should stall or reverse as the heat dome pulls the recent moisture back out of the ground. And watch that Pacific index through the late summer and into the fall, because if it keeps climbing toward a strong El Niño, the odds it has been quietly loading will start to come due in the back half of the year. Those four things, the containment, the monsoon, the next map, and the ocean, are the dials that will tell you whether this drought is peaking or still building. And here is the thing I keep coming back to. The reason this whole story matters, beyond any single fire or any single hot weekend. Every piece of what I have shown you is public. The drought map is public. The fire reports are public. The ocean index is public. The heat forecast is public. None of it is hidden behind a wall. It is all sitting right there, in the open, updated every week, free for anyone to read. And still, somehow, the whole of it stays invisible, because we consume it in fragments. A fire story here, a heat story there, a note about a reservoir somewhere else, and we never assemble the fragments into the single continental picture they actually form. That is the real reason no one is talking about it in the way it deserves. Not because it is secret, because it is scattered and slow and undramatic in any single moment, and our attention is built for the opposite of all three. The drought's greatest camouflage is not concealment. It is our own inability to hold a slow, large, quiet thing in our minds long enough to see it whole. So take one last look at the whole machine. All of it at once. The way we assembled it. A fire in Utah that no crew can stop. Because the fuel has been dried past the point of resistance. 2/3 of a country abnormally dry or worse, with nearly a third in severe drought, and a piece of it in true water emergency. An atmosphere growing thirstier by the degree, pulling moisture out of the ground faster than the rain can replace it. A feedback loop with three corners, drought and heat and fire, each one feeding the other two, running with no break in sight. A heat dome loading up this very weekend to pour more energy into all of it. A snowpack that failed months ago and left the reservoirs low. A groundwater reserve being quietly emptied beneath the surface. And out in the Pacific, the master switch that steers drought across this planet clicked into a warming position and still climbing. Every one of those is real, everyone is documented, and everyone is happening at the same time, on the same country, right now. And that is what makes the real question so unsettling, and it is the question I promised you at the start. Everything I have described, the fires, the heat warnings, the 2/3 of the country, is happening now, in early July, before the peak of summer, before the strongest heat, and before that Pacific Ocean signal has fully arrived. This is the drought at the beginning of its dangerous season, not the end. So the question is not how bad is it right now. The question is, what does the American West, and the water supply that tens of millions of people depend on, look like when the true strength of this El Niño arrives on a countryside that is already this parched, already this overheated, already burning at 0% containment in July? We are watching the opening act of the dry season, and the opening act is already a fire no one can stop. The rest of the summer is going to answer a question we should have been asking all along, which is not whether the water is running low. It is how much lower it can go before the country finally looks up from the flames and notices the ground beneath them has been disappearing all along.